Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
It was just over a week ago, on Valentine's Day, that the Trump administration wiped 1,000 employees off the National Park Service staff without any apparent strategy other than that they were dispensable, staff still on probation, and so lacking any real protection for being fired without cause. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Those cuts swept across the 433 units of the National Park System, taking custodial workers, scientists, search and rescue staff, even lawyers. Today, we're joined by one of the 1,000 who lost their jobs, Angela Moxley, who was just 10 days shy of clearing probation when she lost her job at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia. Angela was a botanist, one of the many Park Service employees who you're not likely to encounter in a park during your visit, but as you'll hear, one whose job is just as vital as that of the park interpreter who takes you for a hike. We'll be back in a minute with Angela.
Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Good morning, Angela. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So it's incredible what's happened to you and 1,300 or 1,000 of your colleagues across the National Park System. The firings a week ago, unprecedented. I've been doing this for many, many decades, and I've never seen anything like this happen. It's got to be an incredible shock to you and your colleagues.
We were completely blindsided. Everyone, I would dare to say, even within the chain of command. And we went from a situation where we knew that this OPM memo had come out, I believe, on Inauguration Day, asking for lists of probationary employees and not really understanding what that meant, but being reassured that NPS would never fire all of its probationary employees. Nothing like that had ever happened. And if that were to happen, it would be new and shocking. To about maybe 2 weeks later, being told, well, it was the Wednesday before the firing, so a week and 2 days before the firing, we knew that our names had in fact been put on the list that was sent up the NPS and DOI chain of command. We had been told that our superintendent argued that all of our positions were essential and that everyone should be retained, but still just not really knowing. Nobody knew what was going to happen with that list. And then the next day on Thursday, basically watching everything unfold before us on Reddit, where there was a massive, in the Fed News subreddit, there was a massive thread where employees were reporting in on which agencies had begun receiving letters. And around 9:30 p.m., I believe it was, I saw the first comment starting to come in about DOI. We weren't really sure because the Park Service is so beloved and has so much support, whether we would be included or not. Nobody knew. Nobody knew, were the people that had been identified as essential being retained, or were these all probationary employees? And we were finding these things out on Reddit. And I went into work the next day. My supervisor didn't know any of this was happening. Continued monitoring the news, monitoring Reddit. About 1:30 p.m., the Washington Post published a story, or that's when I saw that they had published a story stating that NPS was firing 1,000 probationary employees. And so it was then basically that I knew. And I don't remember if the story said it was all probationary employees or if certain ones were being kept, but I just knew, and that it was just a waiting game at that point for the letter to come. I sat at my desk for the next 3 hours, 1 hour past when I was supposed to leave, waiting for this email to come. I eventually left at around 4:30, and then I started getting texts from colleagues saying that they had gotten their letters. I got home and I waited for another 2 hours. I had my work computer with me, and finally it came through at around 6:47. I want to make it clear our supervisors weren't involved in this decision. Most of them found out at the same time as we did. So yes, we were shocked and completely blindsided.
Now, what exactly is a probationary employee? I've heard different definitions. It might be somebody who just started a job. It might have been somebody who's been working for the Park Service for some years, but transferred possibly to a new park, to a new role, and they might be on probation under that new role. I mean, can you give me any explanation for how that works?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm not an HR expert. So, just with that caveat, but I can speak for myself that I was on probation for 1 year. I started at Harpers Ferry on February 25th, 2024. And so I was considered to be on probation until February 25th, 2025, which is 5 days from when we're having this interview. And when you're on probation, it's easier for them to terminate you than it is for someone who's not on probation. So probationary employees can be terminated if a pre-employment condition was discovered. My understanding is that if they were to discover something from before your employment that would have disqualified you, such as the fact that you had, I don't know, committed a felony, or anything that they could flag you for in your background check that they missed if they discovered that information, or they could fire you for performance reasons. So those are the two reasons that probationary employees can be fired. I believe at some agencies and in certain positions, the probation can be 2 years or even longer, but for my position, it was 1 year. I also believe if you leave your agency, go to work for another agency, and then come back, you start all over again. I don't think if you go to another park that you're considered to be on NPS probation, you would have to leave NPS altogether. But again, not an expert. Yeah, can't say that for sure, but
and the letters, the emails that went out, they were pretty terse and pretty insulting. I would say if I got one, I mean, it reads, "The department determined that you have failed to demonstrate fitness or qualifications for continued employment because your subject matter knowledge, skills, and abilities do not meet the department's current needs, and it is necessary and appropriate to terminate during the probationary period." I mean, just to get something like that would take the wind out of your sails. And then, you've been working there for, just shy of passing probation. I'm sure you had performance reviews during that period, no?
yes, we had our performance reviews. It was a process that we went through over the summer. and I had earned an exceeds expectations rating. So in government, you can be rated as fully successful, exceeds expectations, and outstanding. At least that's what it is in NPS. And I had earned my final rating was a 4.4 out of 5 possible points. So it's just shy of the outstanding category. NPS had actually given me a small cash award for my performance. It was signed by the NPS's Associate Director of Workforce and Inclusion. Um, as far as my subject matter knowledge, I had actually been asked over the summer by the resource manager at a different park to serve on a subject matter expert hiring panel. And I had also been serving on a ranking panel for park project proposals. And that very morning that I was fired, I had turned in my score sheet and my comments in which I was contributing my subject matter knowledge to this process. So, and my supervisor, as I stated, did not agree with this and had, the entire time that I worked there, had constantly been giving me positive feedback and saying, this is exactly what the team needs and keep doing what you're doing. And so, as with most of the other people that this happened to, the performance justification is just completely unfounded. It didn't take the wind out of my sails so much as because we don't believe what they're saying. It's more just infuriating and also seems such a flimsy thing to base it on because we all have documents that can prove otherwise, if the courts will do their job.
So, yeah, where does that leave you? I know there are some unions that represent some Park Service employees that are planning to sue if they haven't already sued over this. I know a number of members of Congress are concerned about it. What's the road ahead look like?
So at my park, we're members. Some of the employees are members of the collective bargaining unit under the National Treasury Employees Union, the NTEU. NTEU and I believe other unions had filed for a temporary restraining order to stop the probationary firings going forward as of today, which is Thursday, the 20th. I think there are still a few agencies that haven't been hit yet. And then if the judge grants the restraining order, they are also asking for an injunction to reinstate all of the probationary employees. But it's not really known how that's going to be interpreted or responded to. And the previous case involving the deferred resignation offer, the judge determined that the unions didn't have standing. So I know the unions are also talking about potentially filing some sort of mass grievance on behalf of the fired employees. And there are a couple of class action lawsuits that might eventually be consolidated. There's just a lot of uncertainty right now. There are several paths that people are exploring, but everyone, including the unions, was completely blindsided by this. And so everyone's just scrambling to react and figure out what to do.
And as we're talking during this interview, I understand there might be another purge, if you will, of Park Service employees coming yet before another reduction in force. I know that the agencies have been asked to try and determine how many employees they can get rid of and how they can go about that. What did you do before you came to the Park Service in February of 2024?
I had worked for almost 2 years as essentially a contract botanist at a different nearby park, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park, another one of our amazing parks in the National Capital area. I had my focus and my expertise there was on imperiled plant species. That particular park has had nearly 200 imperiled plant species recorded throughout the years, and we have around 30 at Harpers Ferry. So prior to that, I originally had a career in print journalism. I worked for newspapers, and then I worked for a nonprofit on their magazine and some of their other communications efforts. And I left that career in 2015 to pursue a career in environmental biology, because I didn't like some of the things that were happening with journalism, but also just really saw how much need there was for environmental careers and people working to protect the environment. So I went back to school and earned my master's degree, and basically had to start all over. In, in my previous career, I was at sort of a mid-level management position, and when I went into this career, I had to start all the way over at the bottom doing internships, until I was able to get full-time with the National Park Service. And there was no, if this hadn't happened, I would be basically today 2 days away, more or less, practically speaking, from the end of my probation, and would be considered a permanent employee of the NPS.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I applaud you for that career change, although I would offer that journalism is probably more important today than it ever has been in a long time. You are you've been working at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. In a previous century, I spent years in West Virginia and loved it, and I can understand why you'd want to work there, especially in botany, because the landscapes are so rich with vegetation. It's just got to be fascinating. I mean, I'm now out in Utah, where it's not as it doesn't seem as conducive to as much vegetation as you have back east. It's just got to be an incredible career with what you have.
Yeah, it's a lush setting is one way to describe it. It sits at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, and basically at the intersection of three states: Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia. And it's hard to describe, but imagine a historic town with a church steeple that's visible from far away and is iconic. At the bottom of a slope, nestled in between the confluence of these two rivers, and then on basically two sides there are mountain ranges. So it's very evocative of Appalachia, and it is breathtaking. Thomas Jefferson visited, and has a famous quote that it's a view worthy of the voyage across the Atlantic. The Appalachian Trail comes through the park. And then there's it tells the history of many different pieces of the American story. Of course, we're most famous for being the location of the abolitionist John Brown's raid on the Federal Armory and Arsenal located at Harpers Ferry. And that is widely considered to be one of the precipitating events of the Civil War. The fact that the Federal Arsenal and Armory were located there also, is of historical significance. And then we have many archaeological sites that represent 18th and 19th century industry in the U.S. And we also tell a piece of the story of African American history, not only being the site of Civil War battles, but also the site of one of the first integrated colleges in the U.S., Storer College, and part of the early civil rights movement in the U.S. So we have a lot of different stories to tell, preserving these pieces of America's past, and of course the lessons that we can learn from it. So it's a really cool place to work, not just being a plant nerd and somebody who loves being outside and hiking on all the different trails that we have there, but also just the cultural and the historical aspect, and all the different things that you can learn about our country by going there.
Yeah, it's just an incredible setting. And so, Angela, were you the only botanist at Harpers Ferry on staff?
Yeah, I was hired specifically because of my expertise in plants. There is also a biologist on staff, and he focuses a little bit more on NEPA compliance, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act compliance, as well as we're trying to get prescribed fire program going at the park, and he also oversees our deer management efforts. And so I was hired to kind of complement those efforts with focus on vegetation.
And some people might say, so what? Why do we need to know about the vegetation? Why should we care?
I mean, that's a good question, and it's one that's really hard to answer. And it's difficult because environmental education is so lacking in this country. And so you're right, most people don't know very much about plants, and they can only identify a few species. And so trying to sum up why my field is so important in a few sentences is always difficult when people don't even have like a background level of understanding. But plants are the foundation of food webs. They provide food for insects. Think of caterpillars, for example. And why does that matter? Because insects provide food for many of the charismatic species that people care about, birds being really high on that list. Birds, a lot of bird species rely on caterpillars to feed their young. A single pair of chickadees, I forget the exact number, but a single pair of chickadees, when they're raising their young, they can feed thousands and thousands of caterpillars. And so if the caterpillars are adapted to feed on native plant species, plants that are not native to this area, I have chemistry that caterpillars and other insects cannot digest. And so when we lose native plants, we lose caterpillars and other insects, and then we start to lose, there are cascading effects to other species that depend on insects. And plants are also foundational to just the concept of biodiversity. And why biodiversity matters is for ecosystem resilience. The more types of species that we have on the landscape, the more those landscapes are able to recover from catastrophes such as drought. It's just I'm not a science communicator, so I haven't thought of all the apt metaphors for why biodiversity is important, but it's just having more cards in the playing deck, basically, to fight back against different things that are facing these landscapes.
No, absolutely. And, we don't want to live in a sterile landscape. There have been much concern in recent years over the decline in monarch butterflies, and why is that, and what role does vegetation play? And of course, there's also the concern over the collapse of bees, the many dozens and hundreds of species of bees, and why are they collapsing, and what does vegetation have to do with that, if anything? And of course, there's the cultural applications. I mean, you live in Appalachia, and the past 4 years, we've spent a lot of time in the National Park Service trying to get indigenous knowledge on how to manage the landscape, and certainly looking at Appalachia and the culture that grew up there once whites reached the New World. A lot of cultural applications involving vegetations and cures and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, plants are an encyclopedia that we can draw on for a lot of our own ills, and we need to figure out how to regain some of that knowledge.
And then there's also the unknown. What medicines might plants provide for, and cures that we don't know yet because we haven't done enough science or research. Which brings me to the next question: is if you're not there on the ground in Harpers Ferry or Chesapeake and Ohio before that, picking up this knowledge, learning from it, what are we losing?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to highlight in doing this interview was that there's been a lot of focus on the visitor impacts to these cuts, which I'm not trying to downplay by any means, but I've seen so many posts about overflowing toilets, and there will also be closed visitor centers. There could be delays in search and rescue responses, and all of that is really, really important. I'm not trying to say that it's not, but there is also a huge behind the scenes effort at national parks to protect the resources that visitors enjoy. And we don't typically wear the flat hat, and the visitors may never encounter us, but without us, there wouldn't be the resources for the visitors to enjoy. And so I really hope that people in addition to speaking up for the toilets, can speak up for the forests, and the archaeology and the museums. So some of the projects that I was working on over the past year, one of them was a wetland restoration project. We have 4 different wetlands at our park that we were working to restore. We had received some funding to bring in a crew to treat invasive plants. They were only there for a short period of time because we didn't receive that much funding. And so I had been trying to continue the work of that crew to remove invasive plants from these wetlands. And then I had been working to build seed mixes that were appropriate for each of the ecosystems at these wetlands. I had gone out in November and December and sowed those seeds. And I had just worked on my field calendar for the upcoming field season this past week or so, and I had plans to go out in March to check the sites and see if anything had started to germinate, and determine next steps. Do we need to put out more seed? Were those the right species? Do we need to look at getting different seeds? What invasive plants do we still need to remove? And so I just had to walk away from that project in the middle of it, and I'll never know the results. I'll never know whether those seeds germinated and whether those seed mixes worked. I had also been making plans to work with the USDA Forest Service to get their technical expertise and potentially some funding to save what is left of the hemlock groves that are at Harpers Ferry. Hemlocks have been decimated by an invasive insect called the hemlock woolly adelgid. And our groves were decimated, but we do have some surviving hemlocks that are not doing that well. And so I was planning to work with the Forest Service to see how we might be able to treat the surviving trees. I'd also, within the past year at Harpers Ferry, documented beech leaf disease. This is an emerging disease in the eastern U.S. It's an invasive nematode that is killing beech trees. We have a lot of beech trees in Harpers Ferry, and so this could wipe out a lot of the forest. There isn't a treatment yet, but I had started working last year to map out where I was seeing beech leaf disease and had plans to continue that work and to start working with our regional office and potentially the Forest Service to figure out some kind of a response. I had also developed a calendar for treating invasive plants at our park. So these are plants species that threaten to smother our imperiled plant populations and some of our sensitive habitats, so like the wetlands that I was talking about. And then what has probably been most heartbreaking for me is that I had to walk away from a year's worth of sensitive data that I had been collecting about the approximately 30 imperiled plant species that we have at Harpers Ferry. So I had been going out to survey for these plant species and to document them, take photos, map them. I had an elaborate field map that I had set up to collect data while in the field. And I had built up all this data and had plans to expand the project and refine it. And I just had to put everything on our shared driver and walk away and hope that someday somebody can use it.
You know, you made an excellent point that to a lot of people, outwardly, the national parks are a place for recreation, to go for a hike, to go for a paddle, to bird watch, practice your photography. And yet there's so much more to national parks: archaeology, paleontology, botany, fisheries. Invasive species in recent decades have been a huge problem. We spent a year at the Traveler writing stories about invasive species across the national park system, including invasive vegetation down at Everglades National Park, for example, the Melaleuca trees that took over the landscape, and the Brazilian pepper. And if you don't fight back against these invasive species, you lose all the native species. And as you said earlier, some insect species, have evolved with a certain type of plant, and they can't necessarily survive with the new invasives. Now, you said you just had to walk away from this shared hard drive. Back a few years ago, when COVID was running rampant across the country, the Park Service kind of shut down a lot of things, and there was some concern over research projects that were long-running research projects that were put on hold because people weren't supposed to come to work or go out in the field or whatnot. We don't know how long this current staffing situation is going to last at the Park Service. For some of your studies, I mean, is a gap of a week or a month or 6 months a big deal?
For plant species, it definitely can be. We need to, for the imperiled plants, we need to be getting out as often as possible to check on them, and to document. Over the winter, I had just happened to go for a walk. I was just going for a walk. I wasn't necessarily doing a survey or anything. And I noticed that beavers had basically mowed down two of our rare plant species that are shrubs, and they're right along the river, and they're just like the right diameter, and they're woody. And so they had very clearly been cut by beavers, and there was a lot of beaver activity all and up and down the river, not just to these two rare plant species. And so that was one of the things that I was going to work on this spring, was going back out to see if those particular plants were going to, a lot of times plants will resprout. And you can tell the trees that have along the river that have suffered from beavers in the past because they have sort of a weird shape to them. They've got branches growing out of branches that were cut. And so I was going to go out and see if these plants had survived, and then try to figure out, do we need to put cages around these or something to protect them from beavers in the future? And then another example would be that in September, I had gone out with another botanist from a different park to one of our locations, and we started our survey and got to our first population that we were going to check on, and it had been cut by a visitor. So it was right along the river, and it was obviously like an illegal or unauthorized campsite. There was like a fire ring and beer bottles, and like it's evident that people have been camping there. And we think that they had cut these plants down to make room for a tent pad. This is a species that is listed as imperiled in Virginia and critically imperiled right across the river in Maryland. And so it was very lucky timing that we happened to go out there soon after this happened. I was actually able to save the seeds from the plants that had been cut. And I went back to my office and sorted out all the seeds that I thought were viable. And then I went back out to the site and re-sowed them directly into the ground. I was really excited to go out this April and to see whether any of those had been germinated. Now I'll never know. I'll never know what happened to those seeds. A lot of the changes to our ecosystems they're happening so rapidly that, yes, is a gap of a couple of weeks or months going to hurt? No, but maybe not. But things can be wiped out overnight by visitors or beavers or whatever it may be. And then, a gap of a year or more, that is definitely, where we are going to start losing the information that we need to manage these places.
Do you know how many other workers at Harpers Ferry were let go?
I do not know the total number for sure, but on our resource management team, we lost 4 people. So it went from 8 people to 4 people.
And what roles were those that were lost?
We had a GIS specialist, we had a museum curator, and a museum technician.
Well, one thing we're trying to figure out, it's been very hard to get information from the National Park Service with the change in administrations. The silence is like nothing I've seen in my 40 plus years of reporting. But it seems like the Skyline Drive, relatively next door to you in Shenandoah National Park, is closed because of some downed trees. Normally we would see a park's maintenance crew respond immediately to remove down trees from the Skyline Drive, and I've got to check with the Park Service to find out what the holdup is, whether it is that they've lost some of their maintenance crews. But a lot of unknowns out there across the national park system, for sure. What about you? What what do you do now? Do you just wait to see what plays out with the potential lawsuits, or do you start looking for a new job? What are you facing?
I have 3 full-time jobs right now, which I've been doing since this happened. One full-time job is speaking out on behalf of the National Park Service. Another is looking for a job, and the third is trying to stay on top of the news. I haven't had a moment to rest or take care of myself since this happened. Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, anyone who this happened to should be looking for another job. I mean, even if we somehow are reinstated, as you alluded to earlier, there is, as far as we know, there's a reduction in force coming, and nobody feels optimistic about it. I don't have firsthand knowledge, but there seems to be a feeling that the cuts are going to be pretty drastic and that parks might be left with, bare minimum staff. And so I'm realistic that even if I were to get reinstated, it might be temporary, even just for a matter of days or weeks. So yeah, I think a lot of people in the federal government, if they're not looking for other jobs, they should be. I don't want people to be blindsided like we were.
Are you surprised by the lack of outcry from Congress?
I know that in Maryland, my senators had a town hall, and I wouldn't say from my senators there's been a lack of outcry. I don't know about my representative if she's been doing stuff. I haven't heard it, but I also haven't gone looking to see. I don't think that it's necessarily fair to say that there's a lack of outcry on behalf of Congress. I mean, I do see a lot of them speaking out. I don't know how much realistically they can do, because
I guess it depends. I guess it depends on the political persuasion of your congressional delegation. I'm in Utah, where the state has made much of the Mighty Five: Arches, Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, and Zion National Parks. They've embraced them as their own, and they've really rallied behind them. The congressional delegation hasn't said anything. In Wyoming, Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton National Park, the congressional delegation hasn't said anything. In New Mexico, where the congressional delegation is all Democrats, you've had outcry. In Nevada, where the 2 senators are Democrats, you've had outcry. So I guess maybe I should rephrase that the lack of outcry from Republican members of Congress. It's hard to fathom what's going on. A lot of champions of the National Park Service come from both sides of the aisle. They've tried to fund the Park Service as best they could over the years, and to sit idly by while this type of impact is being delivered, seemingly without strategy, to the National Park Service, seems outlandish to me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it does seem that support for the Park Service has always been a bipartisan issue, even if at the end of the day we're still underfunded and majorly understaffed. I will say that I have been encouraged by the outpouring of support that I've seen. I had posted something on LinkedIn, and it was just for to update my personal network, which is very small, because it happened so fast, and I wanted to tell other people I worked with at NPS what had happened. And for some reason, it took off, and a lot of people have seen it and commented on it, how much they support. And I can only hope that those people are doing more than just commenting and sharing their support on a post, and then they're actually going back to their Congress people and protesting this and all the other. I mean, all the other cuts. And of course, the National Park Service is just one tiny piece of what's happening right now. So if those people are not actually speaking out in the venues that matter, and if they're not telling other people in their lives what's happening, then their support doesn't really mean a whole lot. So I would say, if you're one of those people listening and you have, personally shown your support for the National Park Service, like, that's not enough. You need to make your voice heard much more loudly. So I wanted to put in a plug for small parks because the big parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite have been getting all of the attention, and they absolutely should. I'm not saying that they shouldn't. But there are, I believe, 433 National Park Service units, and most of them are small. And they include the National Historical Parks like mine, national battlefields, and national seashores. And I think many people have the idea that these aren't national parks, but they are units of the National Park Service. And in Maryland, we have 6, and then we have 2 very close by in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And all of these parks, they're embedded in their local communities. They employ local residents, and they support the local economy. So Harpers Ferry is a huge driver of tourism in Jefferson County, West Virginia, especially for all the small businesses in the towns of Harpers Ferry and Bolivar. So, there are plenty of people advocating for the big parks, and please continue doing that. But I would also ask people to speak up for the small parks too.
Absolutely. I mean, we're coming into the spring season in just a number of weeks. As you mentioned earlier, there could be dirty restrooms, but then there could be a lack of resource protection. We saw that in the end of 2018, going into 2019, when there was a partial government shutdown, and the first Trump administration thought that they could keep the parks open without adequate park staff, and there was some vandalism and a lot of garbage thrown around. So hopefully, saner heads will prevail in the coming weeks, sooner than later, and reverse some of these actions they've taken.
Yeah, I mean, time will tell, but it seems very bleak. We talked a bit about natural resources. I want to put in a plug for my cultural resource and my museum colleagues, because they're feeling this too, and what they do, especially the cultural resource people, they ensure compliance with federal laws and policies regarding historic structures and archaeological resources. These are the buildings that people see when they go into parks. And then the museum collections, they need to be cared for and taken care of, or they'll deteriorate. They were affected too. So again, just the behind the scenes people, we're not leading the tours, we're not showing people the objects, but we're taking care of all that stuff.
Yeah. That's Angela Moxley. She's one of the 1,000 members of the National Park Service that lost their jobs on Valentine's Day. Angela, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your story.
And thank you so much for all you've been doing to raise awareness.
That's our show for this week. I hope you found it both interesting and concerning. If you are concerned over what the Trump administration has done, not just to the National Park Service, but other land management agencies, let your congressional delegation know that you do not approve of this approach on running government. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Rethenchek.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Travelers coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.